Hey everyone, welcome to our third online meetup. It's a real pleasure to see everyone here, and we'll have some quite interesting discussions today relating to the topic of security. This is what we'll be focusing on today, quite an important topic, especially since we have so many new security improvements in 5.0. A little bit about myself. You've probably heard from me before if you've attended meetups. My name is Arturs Lontons. I'm a technical engineer, trainer, and a consultant at Zabbix, and I'll be your host for today. So before we start our presentation, let's agree on a couple of rules. First off, all of our microphones, myself included, when my colleagues will be speaking, will be muted. Use Q&A to ask any questions. As always, we will be answering your questions live during the presentations, and we will be answering your questions also vocally, verbally, after the speaker does his presentation. We will take a couple of questions from the Q&A section, and we'll just answer them live verbally. Other questions will be answered right there in the Q&A section. For other discussion, networking, commenting on the presentations, applauding, thanking each other, and so on, let's use the chat. This way we can kind of neatly sort questions go in Q&A. All other discussion goes in chat. If you wish to post something on social media channels, use hashtag Zabbix Meetup online. You can see it on the screen right now. So without further ado, for our first speaker, a good colleague of mine, a senior trainer nowadays, Kaspars Mednis will be talking to you about one of the new features in 5.0, support of blacklists and whitelists for metrics on the agent side. So let's welcome Kaspars. Go ahead.
Thank you, Arturs. And yes, my name is Kaspars. I'm currently a senior trainer at Zabbix. And today I will show you some new functionality of Zabbix 5, whitelists and blacklists, which may a little bit secure your environment. So let me start. First question is why? As I said, for security concerns, right? Because some item keys maybe are pretty dangerous. So first, Zabbix agent can gather sensitive information from configuration files, from log files, from password files. Like you can see on my example on the screen, I'm using Zabbix get utility to check my item keys, because it is a very easy way how to do it from command lines. And you can see, so Zabbix get host is some production host, and I can easily get file contents from etc passwd, which is usually pretty unsafe. Yes, user can get a list of other users, their home directories, user IDs, and this is usually a pretty sensitive information. Yes, also other files with plain text passwords maybe can be stored on the system, or log files may contain some sensitive information. So all this usually is accessible by default with some Zabbix file keys. Of course, if Zabbix agent has read permissions, yes, but as you can see, etc passwd is always accessible by default. So that's one security issue. Another security issue is that actually, if the system run commands are enabled, you can issue some potentially dangerous commands, like look at my screen, like system run wget, which can download some malicious code from some website and execute it directly on your system. And this is definitely not something you want to happen. Or maybe a user can remove some important log file after something was done, or whatever. So those are just a few examples which may happen with a system run command. Of course, by default, on Linux systems, those commands runs under unprivileged user account by default, which means you are a little bit protected. But just think about Windows agent. On Windows agent, Zabbix runs from the system account by default, which means it has unlimited access to local system. It can start services, stop services. It can run any commands, access any file, modify registry. You can execute any VMI query using Zabbix. So if you are quite experienced Windows administrator using VMI queries, you can also do a lot of things. So basically, you want to protect yourself from such things happening by using Zabbix agent. And how? Zabbix 5 introduced a new feature called blacklists and whitelists. Previously, before Zabbix 5, there was just one setting, enable remote commands 0, which of course disabled system run checks, but you just have possibility to disable all system run checks, and you still did not have possibility to disable access to files, access to log files, and any other item keys. So on this screenshot you can see, yes, so this was a previous setup on Zabbix 3, on Zabbix 4. On Zabbix 5, you can use a combination of allow key and deny key. So by default, all the items are allowed, and then using two new configuration parameters, allow key with a pattern or deny key with a pattern, you can allow or deny some specific keys, which means basically you can create whitelists and blacklists. What is a pattern? Pattern is a wildcard expression which may be used in both the kname and parameters. And those parameters are a little bit different from other Zabbix configuration options because unlimited numbers of allow key, deny key are supported. So you are specifying them actually more than once. And because you are specifying them more than once, it is the order which actually matters. So rules are checked in the order in which they have been specified. And the list will be parsed from the top to the bottom. And as soon as any item key will match the rule, the item will be allowed or denied, and the rule checking will stop. So if an item will match both allow rules and deny rules, the result will depend on which rule is defined first on your list. Next screen here, you can see the workflow. So if you have denied some key, you have deny condition, Zabbix is checking this key against the list. So let's say you have a key. First entry is allow key, and there is no match. So Zabbix agent will check next line, and let's say next line is deny key, which will match the pattern, which means the key will be denied, and that's all. Processing stops. Yes, so this allow key, which is below deny key, will be just ignored. If you have allow key, it works similarly, right? It will match against first entry, second entry, no match, no match, no match, and then if the allow key will be matched, then it will be allowed. Yes, and any deny rule will be ignored because it's already matched and allowed. And here are two very simple examples about correct and wrong order of such keys. So first example, allow key, you are allowing any file operation like file size or file contents with any file located in var log my application. Yes, so any file which is located in my application or any file which is located in my DB is accessible. And then you have a deny rule. which means this will deny all operations for any other files. Yes, so so Zabbix will try to match this. If nothing is matched, it is just denied. Wrong order. So if you have deny rule, deny key system run, it will just immediately deny any system run command. And you can have unlimited list of allow keys with a safe system run commands below. It will be just ignored. Yes, so you need to put the allowed keys above the deny key, and then it will work. Patterns. So as I said before, allow keys and deny keys are using patterns, are using the wildcards, and I will give you some examples of those patterns. So wildcard character will match any number of any characters in certain position. It may be used in both the key name and parameters. I will have examples on next slides. And parameters, if they are specified, must be fully enclosed in the square bracket. So system run with just opening bracket and wildcard is wrong syntax. Also, don't specifying the opening bracket is the wrong syntax. And this VFS file, wildcard for any operation, wildcard for any parameter, is the correct syntax, which will be accepted by Zabbix agent. Pattern examples. So here you can see some examples of the patterns, like VFS file .star will match any keys starting with VFS file with any parameter. Yes, so it will match this, but be very careful. The syntax with patterns is a little bit tricky. So look here. This definition actually does not match VFS file size bytes without any parameters. Okay, in this example, the key will not work because it requires some parameters. Yes, but it will be still in theory accepted. And the same goes for wildcard without specifying parameters, or CPU load. Look here. CPU load will match CPU load with square brackets, will match CPU load with parameters, but it will not match CPU load. Right here. So let's make a few examples. So deny key is VFS file and the wildcard, and actually it is not correct way how to specify. So be very careful. Yes. If you will try the VFS file contents without any parameters, of course, it will be denied, but this key is expected to have some parameters. So if you will try to access some file, it will actually work. Yes, so be very careful. You will think that you have denied something, but actually access to your files are granted. Next example is about CPU load. So this key, of course, will deny CPU load per CPU or average load. So everything will be denied. But look here, simple key, system CPU load without any parameters actually is allowed. Yes. So the setup may be a little bit tricky. And as I said, I really recommend doing a full test before implementing this into production. Notes. And as a conclusion, few notes. So allow keys and deny keys, they are not affecting following configuration parameters. So hostname item, host metadata item, and interface item still can use those keys which are denied, because in such places, they are not accessible by users. Yes, those keys are just specified in configuration. For configuration purpose, they cannot be executed by users intentionally, and this is safe. Yes, so you can deny some keys, and they will still work for those parameters. Next, if a specific key is disallowed or denied, the item will be just reported as unsupported, without any hints. So it will be unsupported just like any other not supported item with invalid key or whatever. This is for security reasons. So actually some intruder will never know which case are not supported or which case are denied. Yes, it will not give any clues about that, and denied remote commands will not be logged. Yes, if there will be some commands denied, you will not see them in the agent log file. Also, be very careful if you are using includes. Zabbix agent configuration allows you to include some additional config files, and you may think that specifying a list there is a good idea. Yes, but because the order really matters, just remember that no particular order of include file should be assumed. So you never know actually which include file will be included first, and you may have some very unexpected results. Command line utilities. Yes, command line utilities, which are agent or Zabbix get, they will also not work. So Zabbix agent with print option will just ignore those keys and will not print any output. Zabbix agent with test option will report back unsupported as expected. And also if you will try Zabbix get, it will report back not supported, yes, because Zabbix get is working just like Zabbix passive check. So those were all the notes, and now one more advice from my side. So what to choose? Choose a whitelist or choose a blacklist. Which is better, of course, depends on situation, but this slide will give you one warning. What may happen if you will rely completely on blacklists? So look here, deny key VFS file contains ATC passwd. So explicitly, you have denied this file and you think that you are completely safe. Yes, it's denied even without a wildcard. So what can go wrong? You can test with Zabbix get. It's denied, so everything is fine. And look here. If somebody is really smart, this path can be written in such way, going back and forward. And you can see here in this path is no combination of ATC passwd. So TMP, ATC, then something else, and then passwd, which means it is completely ignored by this deny key, and actually you are getting back the result. So in such situations, maybe having a whitelist of some allowed checks is better, because it may be very hard to predict any possible situation, because some very smart person who is, for some people, their brain are always working in the wrong direction and they are finding injections and workarounds, can go around the key. So I would personally recommend relying more on whitelists. They are safer because blacklists maybe can be cheated. So that's all. The presentation is over. Now I'm ready from the answer question session. So if you have any questions, please.
Thank you, Kaspars. We do have a couple of questions.
Of course.
Yes. First off, a simple one. What about those double quotes in the allow key or deny key? Are they ignored?
Yes. Yes. But actually, you don't need to specify. Yes, double quotes are specified on item keys for escaping, right? The deny keys does not actually require them.
Okay, thank you. Then next up, what happens if we use incorrect syntax over here? Will it be ignored or does it depend?
I'm 99% sure that Zabbix agent will just crash and not start. Because it's a wrong config option. Usually with wrong config option, Zabbix agent will not start. I have not tested this. Actually, this can be tested very simple in a few minutes, right? Just create a key restart agent and you will see the result. Yes, but I expect that it will crash.
Or if you, I think if you have misconfigured like your parameters or something like that, made a typo there, it's just not going to work. It's going to ignore, deny something else than you expect, for example.
Of course. As I said, always when you are creating such list, of course, you cannot test any possible situation, right? But at least do some tests. At least test that is expected to works, right? Because typos, Zabbix agent will not know any about typos. It will just understand it exactly as it is. If you will deny non-existing key, it will still be denied because, maybe it's a user parameter. So it may exist in theory, right? So no syntax checks here.
And then one more, if the denied item for the denied key is showing unsupported in the front end, if we do increase the debug level, will we see some message in our logs regarding it?
As far as I know, not. So it says it's not logged. I will recheck this after the presentation. So I think in the chat I may give some, let's say, more detailed answer. I don't like giving answers when I'm not 100% sure, right? But at least documentation says it's not logged, and there is no word about debug.
A couple of more real fast questions since you're here. Let's cover them all. So deny lists and allow keys basically protect the machines from a compromised Zabbix server. Is that it, or is there some other use case?
Okay, if you will look at my presentation, I may get back like one slide. Yes, basically against compromised Zabbix server, because any user with admin permissions can create hosts, right, and can create dangerous keys. But I'm using the command line Zabbix get, which is actually a standalone utility which can be installed on any machine, even on Windows machine, right? So it is just some compromised computer, some intruder who knows the address of the agent. And if the agent, of course, accepts connections, right, there is option server, which is also protecting you from unknown addresses. But if the connection will be made and connection will be accepted, then yes, this is additional protection.
And one more thing, I guess that's not a question for you, just maybe a general concern. So from the audit perspective, why shouldn't the denied commands be logged? I guess that's just a design decision from our side, and maybe if maybe you can comment on this. Yes, Kaspars, what do you think?
Actually, unfortunately, I'm not developer. Yes, so I have read the specification, and this was clearly on the specification, right? So it was just designed like that. Why not? Because maybe, okay, as a quick idea, if it will be logged there, then if the intruder has access to Zabbix log, he may get some clues.
Was denied.
Yes.
Yeah, and once again, if you think that it should be logged, you can always create a feature request, and if you're vocal enough about it and there's enough traffic and it's really easy to implement, then yeah, we might consider it. No problem. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thank you, Kaspars. Managed to answer all of the questions. That was more than the 3 that I promised you. That was like 5 or 6, but hey, you did well.
Okay, that happens. I'm a senior trainer, so
exactly.
I can take more. Okay, thank you for listening me, and I will give word to the next speaker then. Thanks.
And for our next speaker, you have probably heard from this person in our previous meetups. He used to talk about databases, all things database in our previous meetups. So next up, Aleksandrs Petrovs-Gavrilovs is going to talk about encrypting connections to the database from front end and the server. So he hasn't really escaped the database topics. So let's welcome Aleksandrs. Welcome.
So hello everyone, nice to see you again. Hope that you saw the previous presentations. They were absolutely correct about databases. I will not escape this road this time. It still is going to be about databases, but this time about the security of the databases, and an example be a bit different. It will be to my SQL database, not PostgreSQL, like were the last ones. So since our topic this time is security, we will talk about how to secure your data that is being sent through to Zabbix from database, front end to database, and all the other way around. So what does really secure mean? Well, it means to be secure by yourself, maybe your environment, maybe your data, something that should be protected from any risks possible. We, of course, won't discuss all of the options on how can you protect your data, but we will discuss one of the most critical ones, specifically encryption. So why do you need encryption? Well, just again, to protect your data if somebody catches that data, maybe somewhere in between, in our case, maybe while it's being collected from the database and used by the server, or again, pushed from the server to the database. Somebody catch some of your network traffic, sniff the packet, and well, without encryption, he will probably get some information, maybe will be able to get something out of it, since in the Zabbix database, you keep a lot, you keep all the configuration, and not just configuration, of course, all the data you collect, including even, well, information about users, information about hosts, addresses of those hosts, some metrics, maybe some critical metrics, your certificates expire, and so on and so on. And how does encryption helps us in this case? Well, encryption helps us encrypt the data to make the data basically unintelligible by some other users. It will transform the data, usually known as plain text, basically characters, numbers, you name it, whatever else is in the data, to the so-called ciphertext, basically something unintelligible, something unreadable by the third parties or untrusted parties, in other words. But authorized parties can get that ciphertext since, again, they're trusted by you and they have some kind of access, something to encrypt it, some key to this information, to the source, well, not the source of this information, but the source of what exactly is there. And even though encryption itself does not prevent interference on its own, so somebody is still able to get to that data, especially if we're talking about not just your own internal network, but if for some reason you maybe have something in the cloud, something locally, there is connection between it, maybe your database is in the cloud, your servers locally, maybe other way around. There are more chances for someone to actually getting in between and getting something out of it. And if even this person does, we most surely don't want him to actually understand what is in the data. That's why we use encryption. And in terms of encryption, there are two ways. There is a symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. So Zabbix can do actually both, and we will take a look at both. At the symmetric one, we will take a quick look, since, well, it's quite simple. And basically, symmetric encryption creates a key for all the users that should or can have access to the information, and you need to share that key between all of them. Asymmetric encryption creates a pair of keys, a public key and a private key. And one of the keys, for example, public or private, can be used to encrypt information, and then the other key can be used to decrypt the information, and those keys are exchanged, well, basically automatically, depending on who you provide with certificates themselves. So I've talked a lot, I mentioned it, but again, why do you need encryption? To keep the data while it's being transferred, while it's being exchanged, to keep it safe, secure, protected, and all the other synonyms to the word secure. And Zabbix itself supports encrypted communications between Zabbix components, basically all of the Zabbix components, using transport layer security, or in other words, TLS, versions 1.2 and 1.3. If you're wondering what is the difference, well, the difference is the performance between two of them. So 1.3 again is a bit faster. You can actually save yourself around 30% of the time that is needed for 1.2 to actually make a handshake. Plus, additionally, 1.3 can actually remember who did already authenticate, what handshakes were already made. So again, it can save you even more time, starting with second or third handshake. But again, what you will be using is dependent absolutely on you and the crypto library that is installed on your system. And in terms of what types of encryption can you use, you can basically use both symmetric and asymmetric, certificate-based, or pre-shared key-based in terms of Zabbix. So what exactly connection between what exactly can be encrypted? So as you can see by a quite simple schema, basically between all of the Zabbix components. So between the proxy database and Zabbix proxy itself, between Zabbix server and all the agents, for example, or between Zabbix proxy and all the agents. Or in our case, we will be delving deeper today in specifically encrypted connection between Zabbix server and server database and the front end. Do not confuse it, not between front end and Zabbix server. Since even though front end shows you if your Zabbix server is not running, they are working with the database, each one of them. And I'm pretty sure at least some of you already installed Zabbix at least once, probably more. You already know that you actually create a separate connection for the server and separate connection for the front end to the database itself, and you install Zabbix. And we will be talking about asymmetric encryption between them. And the same that you will see today can actually be used between proxy database and Zabbix proxy. And of course, encryption certificates, for example, absolutely do not need to be the same as between Zabbix server and server database, or as between proxy database and Zabbix proxy. So you can use different if needed. So you probably noticed that some whole presentation about encryption between database and front end and server. So why is a separate presentation? Well, because with the agents, for example, or with the proxies, you can do asymmetric encryption quite simply. I would say quite fast. Basically, just following this slide as you see here. So you would need to just generate a key that will be used to encrypt the data while it's being exchanged, sent one way or another. Save it to a specific file, then update, of course, the agent configuration, just as you see here. Restart the agent to make the changes actually live, and then update the front end. Or again, change front end first, and then restart the Zabbix agent. But why specifically with database? Why presentation about the database? Again, because it's a bit not so simple, and because, of course, because all of the data is kept where? Is kept in the database, and well, we want to make sure that only us, our Zabbix server, our database, and our front end know how the data actually looks like, not somebody untrusted in between. So if you are going to follow this instruction step by step, this is what you will need for the setup. And this is what I have used myself. So I used, of course, the Zabbix 5.0. Why? Because in version 4.0, there were not the feature to actually make your connection encrypted between DB and the server and between the front end and DB was not available. So it's a new feature. It's 5.0 feature. That's why you will need 5.0. You don't really need two VMs, but since all the really secure, more secure installations, maybe clustered ones, maybe for the reason of HA, maybe just because you want to actually have separated resources for each of the components of Zabbix, probably will use more. And again, just to show you how it would look like. And of course, since MySQL 8, since again it's more secure, and I showed you most of the time Postgres, so I decided it's time to use something, well, maybe not new for you, but new for the presentations for sure. So let's get to the actual steps on how to encrypt connections between database and Zabbix server and Zabbix frontend. And as you noticed, I'm not just telling you should use encryption. I will, of course, show you how to configure it. And that's actually what we do here at Sport, we not just tell you to do that, we show you actually how. So the first thing you need to do is prepare VMs. Prepare as much as VMs as you will be using. In my example, that's 2 VMs, but maybe you want to have a front end on a separate VM. Then you will probably need 3 VMs to actually make a setup you wish to use. But if you're using 2 again, then make one separate for your database, where your database will be located. So all the resources of that VM will be basically used by the database. And the second one, which will be used for the Zabbix installation itself, Zabbix server, Zabbix frontend, and also used as certificate authority, or basically the authority that issues the certificates for our components. And then make sure you update the host files on both VMs. Since again, this is a local network, I did not used any DNS settings in that, so I needed to update etc host. If you use DNS, you can also, of course, update DNS, especially since we will be providing common names in the certificates, and they're actually used in verification of the certificates in Zabbix. But I will remind you about that soon enough. So the first thing we will do is go to the future Zabbix server /CA or certificate authority server. And we will take a look where our configuration file of OpenSSL is located. By default, it is etc PKI DLS OpenSSL CNF. If you already are or have a CA, probably it will be other other location, so you might need to recheck. Just as a side note, well, in these instructions, we are using self-signed certificates. Why? Because, well, basically, that's an option, especially if you're using this setup in internal network. You can, of course, use, for example, GoGetSSL, but the steps would be a bit different. Plus, you would probably need to use, not probably, for sure, I would say you would need to use certbot to actually reissue certificates, since as you know, for GoGetSSL, they are you can use them for a couple of months and then you need to reissue them. With a self-sign, you can even create a certificate that will be valid for 10 years, which is not a good option, but for the certificate authority itself, it might be, and you can reissue certificates, well, at least once a year. So after that's out of the way, find the CA location. Again, the default location is, as you can see right here, it's etc PKI CA, and create a subdirectory in it. So make dir etc PKI CA private. If something is different, you can use make dir -p to actually create all the directories along the way. And after all the directories created, create a pair of keys. The first one, the initial one, that will be used to actually exchange information. So again, we are using OpenSSL, we are using a SSL certificate, so we just copy this command and paste it as we need. We will use X509 standard to create the certificate, to add the data, which will be used in certificate validation. And we provide, of course, the directory. Well, the keys will be kept. We provide the days, how long the pair of keys will be valid, so 10 years. And of course, the encryption itself, so RCA 4K. After you paste the command, you will be prompted with a request to create a password and fill in information for the certificate for the CA. So you will be asked quite some questions. All of them, of course, are important, since the certificate will be basically assigned to the organization you provide. Make sure you provide them so it will be precise and, well, quite easy to remember. But since we will be signing quite some certificates and creating some of them, you can do things a bit easier for you and less confusing, so you don't need to remember a lot. You can edit the OpenSSL CNF file, just as you see here, and change the default organization values. And then every time you will create a request, you will see the values you provide in those same questions you see here. So for now, you can see those are default city, default company, section, but then you will see whatever you will type in right there in the configuration file. After that is done, or if it's done, make a directory for actually signing the request. Make sure it's make dir. You can use -p again to create the subdirectories and name it something easy to remember, like for example signing requests or just requests. And then create a directory where the new certificates signed and issued will be actually kept. So you can easily find them, since we will need to copy them to the DB, for example, to the DB server a bit later. Then create a certificate sign-in request for your Zabbix / certificate authority server with the common name, just like you added in the hosts file. Why? Again, because the common name in the certificate and the common name that you will later provide for the front end as a host name or in the Zabbix configuration file will actually be used for validation. And if it's different from your DNS or host name in the host file or the machine, the actual authentication will be unsuccessful, and you will see an error in your Zabbix server log that, hey, cannot validate this certificate. So again, make sure the names are correct. For the Zabbix, use a common name like, again, Zabbix localhost local, and then make a sign-in request. Then create another sign request, but this time for the DB server. Again, make sure that the common name that will be asked to provide to you by the request itself is the same as you created in the host or in your DNS. So after signing requests are made, create the index.txt and the serial files which are needed by OpenSSL to keep track of the signed certificates. So the first thing you do by the touch is you actually create the file that will be keeping information. And by echo 01, you actually provide the numeration. So after that, each signed request will be will be added to this file, and you will see each certificate with a number, starting with the number that you provided by the echo. So by the end of this, you should see about three certificates. One is the CA, and one for the DB, and one for the Zabbix itself. And then create a signed certificate for your Zabbix CA. So basically answer yes when you see the questions on screenshot prompted. So as you can see, again, we provide the policy, basically policy anything, just name the policy as you see fit. We provide that it will be valid for a year, and we provide where and how the files will be named. So we are accepting that we're signing certificate, and then we are basically committing that this is a certified request. So this is basically, in other words, legitimate request. And then the same way we create a signed certificate for the database. Again, we will need all those files to actually make an encrypted connection. And then we go back. Then we finally go to MySQL server. And then you will need to install MySQL server, start the actual process, make a secure installation, make sure it's all yes. You don't want, it to be unsecure. You don't want any outside connections from the root, and so on. And create a directory for the certificates that will be used by MySQL. And of course, make sure the ports are opened. This is just an example of how it would look like. So after that is done, you will need to copy the certificate files, the ones that we created. So basically the certificate itself, let's start in the right order. So the key itself, the key that will be used to encrypt, decrypt the data, the certificate, and the signed certificate that is actually valid now, and the CA certificate, so we can validate that this certificate was signed by the CA. We will use SCP since it's CentOS 8, it's available out of the box, and we provide basically the connection details to the server, to the CA, where the certificates are kept, and then providing the directory will be keeping MySQL certificates locally. Then we update the permissions to allow the MySQL to actually read the files, and then we will need to update the MySQL configuration file so it actually knows, so MySQL knows where those files are located, and then we restart the MySQL to make changes live So MySQL again knows about those files and actually includes them in its configuration. After which we can log into MySQL and show variables like SSL to actually see if the SSL authentication is enabled. And as you can see, we do have it enabled, have OpenSSL yes, have SSL yes, and we see the paths that are actually used by MySQL to get those files. But that's not it. Still, as you saw, I've logged in as root, and I didn't need any authentication. Plus, create a user for Zabbix and Zabbix DB next after that. So create user Zabbix at IP identified with MySQL native password by password. And you can see here a line MySQL native password, which is quite critical if you are using a MySQL newer than 8.0.3. Since, well, they actually updated after this version the encryption protocol, and it's not specifically the same that Zabbix uses, so you can get error out of this. So make sure you use this command just as it is here. Then create the database, the Zabbix database that we'll be using with a collation, of course, just as usual. And for that user, we just created with a MySQL native password. Restrict this user's access to Zabbix database only by providing Zabbix at IP. If you just look, for example, at the steps of the installation, default installations that are available on our website, it will say localhost. Not this time. You will need to specifically provide IP to make it secure for sure. And restrict this user to always require a certificate to actually make a connection. And after you do this, check if those configuration rules are actually applied by executing a command like select user and the specific tables like which host, which cell type, and which MySQL user. And as you can see, it's cell type any, so it will use, well, basically any SSL. It should use any SSL, or it won't be able to actually authenticate. Then install Zabbix repository on Zabbix CA server the usual way. Clean all, install Zabbix server, frontend, and agent, and then go back to the Zabbix database server to transfer initial schema and the data, because you will still need it to create a database. And then on the database server, import the initial schema, just as you did with Zabbix. You can, of course, use the Zabbix user. Then don't forget to provide the command like require SSL, but still you can do that under root user too. And then verify that all tables are in place by logging back into the MySQL, typing in use Zabbix, so use Zabbix database and show tables. This is the number you should see. So make sure then, by going back to the Zabbix server, you actually configure the encryption for Zabbix server. So make a Zabbix server SSL directory. Again, if you don't have something in between, make sure you use -p to create all of it. And since the CA and Zabbix server is one and the same, copy certificate files, copy them from the directory you've created them in, and again, update permissions on those files. You can do it like this. You can use, of course, chmod -R if you want to do it on the folder and so on too. So Zabbix can actually read them, and then go and edit the Zabbix server configuration file where you can see some old parameters like the database access. So provide the usual name, user, and password you actually use for that user you just created, and then update SSL related parameters. So right here we have an option dbtls connect, and you can see it verify full. There are actually different options available, like for example check CA, where you can make it less strict. So verify full will also verify the common name we provided in the certificates and the host name. But there are either just less secure, I would say, options that can actually allow you, for example, not to check the common name, and you can find all of them in the documentation. And then update the file location like CA file, cert file, key file. Make a patch SSL directory on Zabbix CA server, because we will also use encrypt connection for the front end. Again, use -p. Copy certificate file is still the same machine. If not, use SCP again, just as we did earlier, for example, with the DB server. Update permissions for the Apache, so only Apache can read those files, or not only Apache, at least Apache can. And of course, configure the time zone by going in your usual zabbix.conf file, finding in etc, php fpmd zabbix conf, and start the Zabbix processes with all the changes made. Now go to your front end, and you will see there on the first step the usual options at the database name, username, password. But that's not all. You will need to also put a tick in the TLS encryption, and you will need to provide the database host, and whatever the options, you will still need to provide the actual common name. IP won't do. It will show you an error that connection is unsuccessful because it actually validates it. And after you enable the TLS tick, you will need to provide again the path to the key file, certificate file, and the CA file, just as you've created them not so long ago. And finish it up. That's basically it. The connection will be successful. You will be keeping your data safe while sending it back and forward from Zabbix, from database, from frontend to database, and so on. And congratulations. With that said, done, you can keep your secrets. And since there's a lot of steps, don't worry, you don't need to remember them just after this presentation. This presentation will be actually, all the slides will be shared later, where you can go through them and recheck them again. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Aleksandrs. It's question time. We have a bunch of questions prepared for you, and hopefully you are prepared to answer them as well. So let's start with something a little bit intimate. What VI extension are you using to get those colors?
I'm actually not using any VI extensions, but I'm using a specific command line interface, I would say, or Sage client, which is called MoboXterm. So if you want to make it customizable in terms of how do you actually see it, well, you can download it and use that.
Yeah, MoboXterm is the one. Yeah, I also use it quite a bit. Really, really nice and really handy. All right. Is there any effect on performance of, for example, history syncers or configuration syncers with the encryption?
Well, we actually discussed it with my colleagues. It shouldn't be. There probably will be, but they should be as minor as it gets. Plus, again, if you use the TLS 1.3, maybe the first couple of handshakes, then it should be noticeably completely, since it will remember the handshakes.
Okay, thank you. Once again, I guess that's pretty much the same question. Will there be an input-output computational processing increase? That's pretty much, yeah. Same thing.
Not input-output, but CPU, maybe.
Okay. Thank you. Is it possible to encrypt Oracle database?
That's a good question. I actually did not try, but it should be. I don't see. Well, again, we are not encrypting the database itself. We are encrypting just connection between them. So I don't see any reasons why it shouldn't be possible, only if some abstractions from Oracle, maybe.
All right. Can we do this procedure on a server that's already installed, or must this be set up initially when installing a fresh Zabbix instance?
You absolutely can, but of course, keep in mind that you will need to actually restart your MySQL and restart your Zabbix. And you will also, not obligatory, but you will need to update. Well, you can delete the configuration file of the front end to make it easier, or if not, you can update it manually. But still, to restart, so you will need to plan your time at least.
Okay. I think that'll be all for now. We've kept you here long enough. The rest of the questions, if we have a bunch of questions, we will answer them in the Q&A section at the very end. Okay.
Thank you very much, Artur.
Thank you. Next up, I'm going to be doing a speech. As always during these meetups, I will also be doing a speech of my own. So let me turn on my camera so you can see me, guys. You can see me. Let me turn on and share my presentation, and we can begin in a moment. There you go. All right, we will be talking about SNMP, specifically SNMP version 3. Nothing necessarily, well, there are some things new in 5.0, but SMP version 3 has already been familiar for you for a while now, forever pretty much, well, not really, but for quite a long while. So let's cover that. Let's talk about encrypting SMP version 3 and some common pitfalls. But first, let's just cover SMP version 1 and 2 and then move on to 3. Which one you should use, why you should use it, what's better, what's worse. So, SMP version 1, standardized back in 1988. Communication is established with SNMP agent on the host device. Supports, unfortunately, only 32-bit counters, so your data is going to kind of roll over eventually. Plain text community string is the only security method that's available for you, and that's why we'll be covering SMP version 3, not 1.2. Because of that lacking security, the community is the only kind of gateway between you and anyone intercepting or messing around with your data. And this is an example of how an SMP version 1 GET works. So we are passing the community, pointing it towards the IP address of our device, and then specifying the OIDs over here. And this is the output that we get. We get a OID result over here and the output, which is the string Linux over here. Improving on it, later on, we're moving on to SMP version 2C. There were some issues with standardizing version 2, so we are kind of sticking with version 2C, the community version. New message format and protocol changes. This improves performance when polling multiple devices. Devices can be bilingual, meaning they support both version 1 and version 2 of SNMP. I won't go into detail how that is implemented. You can always find out on Google, but you have to be aware that, yes, that can happen. Devices can be bilingual, and some devices aren't. Some devices support only version 2 or version 1. This time we have 64-bit counter support, and eventually when I was chatting about this presentation with my colleagues, they pretty much said that, hey, so I said that 64-bit should be enough, right? And my colleagues were like, nah, we've seen these counters roll over even with 64 bits. So that sometimes happens too, but most of the time that is enough. Still relies on a plain text community as the only authentication measure. And the SNMP GET over here is quite similar. SNMP GET version 2C, community public. And there we go. We are getting our incoming traffic. And this HC is the 64-bit counter for incoming traffic. And then moving on to SNMP version 3. Nowadays, with SNMP version 3, we have support for message encryption. We have support for context on a single device, meaning that we can select which MIBs we are polling according to our context. So that's another kind of security or isolation measure that can be used on our devices. We support MD5 and SHA, by we, I mean SNMP version 3 authentication protocol. And for our message encryption, we support DES and AES encryption. And as you can see, if you take a look at those SNMP GETs with version 3, as you can see, we are getting a bit more complex over here. We are specifying the authentication password. We are specifying the privacy password. We are specifying the protocols for those. So we're specifying the username. So a bit more complex. And this is where kind of the question gets raised. So which one should I use? Because yes, SNMP 3 is more secure. It's safer for you by quite a bit. But which should I use? If it comes between selecting version 1 and 2C, 2C will pretty much almost always trump version 1. The only reason why I can think you should maybe stick with version 1 is if your device simply doesn't support version 2C. Then of course you're kind of just left with, hey, I gotta use version 1. That's the only thing that my device is supporting. And then the complexity. SNMP version 3 is more complex to configure. Yes, from the device side and also from Zabbix side, from SNMP GET side. SNMP version 3 devices can cause issues if they're not RFC compliant, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Such things like static engine boots time, non-unique engine IDs can cause problems with Zabbix specifically, but it does provide immense security improvements over version 1 and 2C. As you saw, encryptions on multiple levels. So let's talk about how to set this up in Zabbix. First off, since we're speaking version 5.0, before 5.0, you had to define your community and SNMP configuration on the item level. So your host had tons of items, and each of them could have different community. Each of them could have different privacy passwords and authentication passwords. So you could easily make a misconfiguration because you had to configure this essentially hundreds of times, especially if you weren't using macros, depending on the kind of items that you had. Nowadays, we moved it to the host level. So on the host itself, you have SNMP version and you have SNMP community over here. And then in case of version 3, you specify all of the other encryption parameters right here on the host interface. And if you wish, you can have multiple interfaces for SNMP, no problem. And also in SNMP version 3, we have the ability to reload SNMP cache. We can clear SNMP properties. Here is the command. I will talk about this more in depth in one of the upcoming slides, but this can save you a lot of headaches down the road, because if you wanted to reload SNMP cache in older versions, you had to do a restart of proxy or the server, which is, can cause you downtime. It takes a while in larger instances, unfortunately. So this is really a lifesaver if you do a lot of SNMP monitoring. So this can reset the cached engine times, engine boots, engine IDs, and credentials for all hosts. And once again, I'm going to talk about when you should do this SNMP cache reload. Next up, for SNMP version 3, configure your SNMP v3 host. As you can see, I have selected over here SNMP version 3 on the interface, provided the context name, provided the username, provided the security level. I'm using both authentication and privacy, and I'm passing these authentication and privacy values as macros. Those are probably hidden macros, once again, a new feature to 5.0, so they're obfuscated. And I'm also using bulk requests over here. Then, once that is done, create your SNMP items manually or via LLD. Create items pointing at the proper OIDs. If required, this is a typo, not OID files, just proper OIDs with the indexes. And if required, use pre-processing to transform the data. Or you can use LLD. Discover indexes on a specific OID with the low-level discovery rule itself of type SNMP agent, and use filters to filter out the unnecessary data. Then specify the OIDs on item prototypes, and these OIDs will be populated by the indexes that you discovered on the discovery rule itself. And you're good to go. Maybe you also want to configure SNMP version 3 traps. In that case, you need to create an SNMP version 3 user in your snmpd.conf. This is how it looks. The user is linked to the engine ID. This is an engine ID over here. This is the username. This is the authentication algorithm and password, and privacy algorithm and password. Then, if you wish to receive SNMP version 3 traps sent with no authentication, no privilege, without any message encryption or authentication, you'll need to add the no auth to the auth user line in the snmpd config, like so. So in this case, we have specified no auth over here for our auth user, which is called trap test. And we have allowed our user to log the details of our traps, to pass the details of the trap to a specified handler program, and forward the traps to another notification receiver. In reality, what we are interested is log and execute for Zabbix. These are the permissions that we should have for our user. And then we can test the traps. So how do we test them? We use snmp trap. Once again, this command is a bit more complex for version 3 than it is for 1 and 2C. And we are passing the context name, the authentication and privacy passwords. We are passing the username, the engine ID, and then the address from which the trap and to which the trap is coming. and the OID for which we're sending the trap and the value that we are sending. Once again, this example will be fully available to you since these slides will be hosted, and you can try and execute it yourself and see what you receive. And you can mess around with these here values to see what gives you what. So, okay, if everything is working great after this, then good. Everything's perfect, but oftentimes we encounter issues with SNMP version 3, specifically with version 3. There are some cases with older versions, SNMP 1 and 2, but those are quite easily to troubleshoot and quite easily resolved. Version 3 is kind of can be a painful experience for you. So what we're going to cover now is how to test our SNMP v3 devices, how to configure in more detail an SNMP v3 interface in the front end, and how to detect any potential SNMP v3 issues. So one of the more common issues is, as I mentioned in the beginning, duplicate SNMP engine ID. Your SNMP version 3 devices need to return the following values in accordance with RFC specification. The engine ID needs to be unique. The engine boots counter, the count of device reboots, also needs to be unique, not a static one. Like, it needs to be dynamic. It needs to actually give you the count of reboots. Sometimes it's dynamic. It just kind of sticks with one. That's it. And then the device uptime also needs to give you a proper uptime, not just be stuck at some arbitrary value. If all three of these are true, then that is a good starting step. Already, the troubleshooting will be a lot easier. But what to do if you're not sure? How can we catch these issues in action? So we will talk about this in a moment. First off, let's cover a bit more simple things. We'll give you an example of how to catch those issues. So devices with authentication and no privilege, and authentication and privilege, not privilege with privacy encryption, respond to a GET request only if all three of those parameters are correct, all three of these ones. Otherwise, if any of those are not correct, you will be seeing something like this in your log file. So first network error, second network error, and eventually your host will go unavailable. This is one of the pointers that maybe you have a non-unique engine ID, maybe you have your boots time is static, boots count is static, or something like that. But this is kind of a vague thing, okay, something's wrong essentially, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint what is wrong at this point. Let's try and figure out what specifically is wrong. First off, let's take a look at the engine ID. I have an example of a script that you can use to get the engine IDs en masse for this here subnet 192.161-1, and the last number will be from 1 to 254. We're going to run an SNMP get, pass privacy password, authentication password to it, and we are going to point it towards an OID. And I'm going to tell you in a moment that there is an OID that you can look at to get your engine ID. Maybe depending on the device, there could be some differences where it's provided and what you have access to. But this is a way, if you replace this OID with the OID on which you have the engine ID value, you can kind of scan your whole network and see if there are any duplicates. This, by the way, is an example of which you can use the textual representation of it. Just replace the OID over here with this SNMP framework MIB engine ID .0. Another way, a bit more brute force approach, I'd say, more complex, but more detailed also, you can do a packet inspection on your Zabbix server or proxy and just kind of analyze all of SNMP traffic and try to catch duplicate engine IDs, and also take a look at these boots counters and engine times. So if your boots counter over here is completely static, maybe you're in trouble. If your multiple devices have the same engine IDs, you're also in trouble. So for some devices, these engine IDs can be automatically or semi-automatically generated. On some devices, they are static, and you need to make sure that, like I said, they are RFC compliant, that they are unique. If they're not, try talking to your vendor. Maybe he'll suggest some internal commands on the device to reset it or kind of recreate it. Or he's going to say, yeah, this is an old device, the engine IDs are static, not much we can do. In that case, you're in trouble. Ask for a refund or something, because the devices should be RFC compliant. That's why you're buying them. That's why you're using them. Next up, let's move on. Misconfigured security. If you have misconfigured SNMP version 3 security, you're going to see something like this. Authentication failure on the item level, incorrect password, community, or key, and in your log files, you will see cannot connect to your device, unknown username. So that's how you can pinpoint misconfigured security. Misconfigured authentication password. You will see cannot connect also on the item, authentication failure. And over here in the log files, the message is going to be different. Authentication failure versus unknown user in case of security. So like this. There is a difference between misconfigured security and authentication password. If your privacy password is misconfigured, what I was able to reproduce in my environment was that the whole interface did go red. Essentially, the host became unavailable. So be careful. These are kind of nice pointers if you have these slides and you have these SNMP issues in your environment. As you can see, this behavior differs depending on which component is misconfigured. So if you wish to troubleshoot this, then there you go, a couple of scenarios: security, authentication password, and privacy password. Once again, there could be another issue over here. So you've changed things. You've changed your authentication protocol, passphrase, privacy protocol, privacy passphrase to correct ones, but you updated it, did a config cache reload, nothing is still working. Your interface is still red, or you're seeing error messages. Why is that? Because you need to perform an SNMP cache reload. And like I said previously, this could be done by restarting the server or the proxy. But now, after making any changes on your interface, do execute this SNMP cache reload command. There are some exceptions, how to kind of force this to happen without SNMP cache reload. But this is just a general rule of thumb. If you're not sure if your cache has been reloaded, do an SNMP cache reload. And make sure that your new configuration has been reloaded and is actually actual in the caches, not the old one, not the previous configuration still stuck in there. And some final notes. If you're experiencing issues with SNMP checks on a host and everything seems to be perfect, maybe you're seeing general failures or something like that, try unchecking that use bulk request checkbox. It's on one of the previous slides where we were configuring our interface. Some devices do and can and do have issues with processing bulk requests. Some older devices especially. So try disabling that and see if everything has gotten back to normal. Disable it, do configuration cache reload, SNMP cache reload, just to be on the safe side that everything has been updated, and see if this has been resolved. Then try testing things out with SNMP gets and SNMP traps, sending SNMP traps. That's how you can test your SNMP traps if they're working from the command line. Just set up the necessary SNMP utils and test it out yourself. If it's working, if you're able to reach your SNMP device from the Zabbix server or proxy and get the values, that's already good. That's the first step. Okay, there is no network issue. My device isn't actually rejecting the request. So that's kind of a good step forward. Then you can move on with other troubleshooting steps I mentioned. Do packet inspection, do SNMP gets on the engine IDs, and so on. And that's pretty much it for me. So we briefly covered SNMP version 3 troubleshooting, briefly covered some of these scenarios, and I think this could be very much of use to you, not just in the audio format, but like I said, you can keep these slides next to your bed on your nightstand, and if someone wakes you up in the middle of the night with, I'm having SNMP issues, please come back to the server room and try and figure out what's going on. You can have these slides beside you and take a quick peek on like a quick troubleshooting steps that can be performed. All right, thank you. Let's take a look at what do we have for questions.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Artur. It was a great presentation, and we do have quite some questions for you. So let's start with the first one. So how do MIB and OID work? How can I get them? And probably how can you get information about what OID actually has behind it?
Oh, wow. That's a very general question. So essentially, we're talking about what SNMP is over here and what's it based on. MIBs are essentially management information bases where you have a list of values that you can pull on a device. Each device that you have in your environment will have its own set on MIBs. Some can be a general MIBs, some can be vendor specific. This whole thing is completely standardized. So you can kind of Google which OID means what most of the time, that they're not like completely logged down by the vendor. And then you can use it. Essentially, all of this should be provided in your vendor documentation. Most of the time, if we're talking about like proper hardware vendors, they will provide you with the documentation of what data can be obtained via what OID or in what MIB. So if you're not sure, I generally suggest just reading a couple of Google pages about what SNMP is and how it works. And if you're not sure how to get MIBs for your device, talk to your vendor. Maybe you can find the MIBs in Google. For many popular devices you can, and then by opening those MIBs up via a MIB browser, for example, you can see what information is available to you on what OIDs, and then you can use SNMP gets to try and get that data and then use the same OIDs when creating a new Zabbix item. And yeah, that's pretty much how you would do it, either via Google or by contacting your vendor directly, and he should forward you the MIB files, which you can then once again load into your MIB browser and go through all of the data that your device does provide you.
Thank you. Yep, that's basically it. And can you help our fellow colleague and maybe tell us what is the maximum IS encryption Zabbix supports for SNMP v3? Does it support IS 128, for example?
Honestly, I'd have to look at documentation regarding specifically if it supports AES 128. I'd probably like to ask someone to do it while I'm answering the other questions, because I'm not sure, like Kaspars said, I don't want to do any guesswork. Yes.
Let me help you out there. Then, well, as far as I just double checked, it basically supports whatever you have on your installed SNMP library. So it's based on your system, not on Zabbix specifically.
Yes, a lot of SNMP, essentially all of the SNMP checks that Zabbix does are based on, it's native, but it's based on a lot of SNMP dependencies, SNMP libraries, and so on. So I imagine this also depends based on it. Yes. Thank you a lot.
How can you actually install? How can you use basically SNMP v3 on Zabbix server, and how can you install it?
So once again, yeah, thank you. Once again, SNMP support is somewhat native. If you're compiling from scratch, you can disable it, but if you're installing Zabbix from packages, it will be installed with all of the dependencies out of the box. And what you need to do is you need to make sure that your device actually supports SNMP version 3. A lot of troubleshooting, like you saw over here, Zabbix pretty much most of the time, I'd say, does everything properly when it comes to SNMP version 3 polling. Most of the time is the misconfiguration on the device side that causes issues. Either SNMP version 3 is disabled, like look for a checkbox on your device, that says enable SNMP version 3, or a drop-down list, which will ask you which version you are using, and select version 3. And that's how you configure it. And then make sure that you have those parameters that we discussed properly set up. And then mess around with those SNMP gets and SNMP walks and so on. Those are command line utilities that you can use to try and communicate with your device. If you can obtain some data that way, that means you're ready to set them up in Zabbix.
Thank you. And how about answering multiple questions in one? So what will happen if servers have duplicate engine IDs, and where it is considered to be an issue on an endpoint, or is it hard-coded in Zabbix?
So by server, I mean if you're polling, servers are the hardware that we are polling, and those usually it's servers. Sometimes mostly it's switches and things like that. So let's just use, for simplicity's sake, switches, and they have duplicate engine IDs. What's going to happen is some weird behavior is going to happen because some pollers, essentially these pollers, Zabbix polling processes, they cache these engine IDs, they store them in their own cache, And once multiple pollers have cached these engine IDs, and some of them are duplicate, once they hit that misconfigured device, that device could go into unreachable and eventually unavailable mode. That's what's going to happen. And this is a Zabbix kind of hard-coded behavior based on SNMP libraries from where it's getting the data. So it's a Zabbix-specific behavior. That's how our pollers work. So eventually, like I said, one of your misconfigured devices is going to become unreachable and possibly unavailable if you have duplicate engine IDs.
Thank you. A couple of more, and I guess we can set you free after that. So does the OID in the SNMP version 2 is the same as with SNMP version 3? Is the only difference is the authentication and encryption?
Pretty much, yes. I've yet to encounter like OIDs that are specific to version 3. Like I said, for version 2 and 1, though, we have those 64-bit counters, and those do have different OIDs. For example, if we're talking incoming traffic and incoming traffic 64-bit counter, that does have different OIDs. Those do, but for version 3, I've yet to encounter something that's like super specific to version 3 and for some reason is not supported. For version 2, yes, there are a lot of protocol changes and things like that. For version 3, most of the time, like I'm not going to say 100% because I've yet to encounter all kinds of things happen on devices. Yeah, maybe there is some vendor lock-in possibly that some MIB files are only supported, for example, only on version 3. Like I imagine some devices could be configured that way. In that case, yeah, you have to kind of take care of that. And maybe they're also running under different contexts, because remember I said different MIBs can be available under different contexts. And if those contexts are hard-coded or configured in some way that, hey, one context only works for SNMP version 2, another only for SNMP version 3, and then some specific MIBs, then yeah, maybe it could be hard-coded on the device itself.
And again, thank you. I guess that's all. Sorry for keeping you that long. Your topic was quite popular. And I guess I'll pass the word to you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Let's give you guys 5 minutes for a couple of questions that you maybe have, a couple of general questions. Meanwhile, because yeah, I think we've answered everything, but let's just give you guys 5 minutes for last minute kind of comments and questions. Meanwhile, I'm just going to take some time and discuss some other things that maybe I'd like to talk to you about. So as you can see, version 5.0 is out. We have a lot of new security features. We talked about database connection encryption. We talked about better SNMP version 3. We talked about allow deny keys, which is also a really interesting subject to discuss in more depth, in more detail. Also, we have our new agent out. Many new features, and we've discussed quite a lot of them in our meetups already. And for the future, we also plan on creating a bunch of new webinars regarding some of these topics. So you can kind of follow them in case you miss a meetup and you want some live interaction. We will have, rather sooner than later, a bunch of new webinars ready regarding different topics, regarding Agent 2, maybe regarding allow deny key, and many, many more. And then we already have an existing series of webinars regarding many different topics, starting from configuring Zabbix from scratch to something more complex like Grafana integrations, monitoring Docker containers, and so on and so forth. So definitely take a peek over there and see if you find anything to your liking, anything that you can use. General, I can see one question coming in. General question, are you going to implement other metrics, TTFB, for example, in the web monitoring of Zabbix in future releases? So I'm not really familiar with TTFB. Feel free to interrupt me, Kaspars or Aleksandrs, if you're aware of what that stands for. But regarding web checks, I know that currently they may be a little bit, let's say there are some limitations on them, on the web scenario specifically, though I'd say we have worked on our HTTP agent quite a bit. So that definitely is going to see some future improvements in the coming months, years. and so on, because that is quite popular. But yeah, I cannot comment from my side. If you do see a feature request regarding that in the bug tracker or feature request tracker, then yeah, it's definitely considered. And if you don't see a feature request, feel free to create one. Maybe it will receive enough traffic to be put on the roadmap. Okay, a question about general security of Zabbix. So just a comment from my side, yes, security is something that we've been working on quite a bit and we'll continue working on as we go on, because we understand that our enterprise customers do care about these encryption capabilities and things like that. And I'd say 5.0 brings a lot security to the table. As you can see, this is why the whole meetup is dedicated to it. Okay, I think that is mostly it for today. Thank you, Aleksandrs. Thank you, Kaspars. Thank you, guys behind the scenes managing and hosting this. It was a pleasure. We covered a lot of things over here. And who knows, we will take a look at these meetups. We also have our online summit up and coming later this year, so take a look at that. It will be a fully online event that we'll be hosting with our CEO and owner of the company, talking about maybe some future roadmap plans. And who knows, if once again, depending on the feedback from these meetups, feedback on our YouTube channels, webinars, forums, things like that, we will decide on topics for further meetups and how we host them and how we do them. It was a real pleasure for me and my colleagues to answer your questions. Always nice seeing a lot of interest going on. And I hope we cleared up a couple of things for you. A couple of new features, a couple of existing features, speaking of SMP version 3. And you can use these slides and use these webinars to secure your Zabbix instance. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Have fun securing Zabbix. Thank you.